When Alex first called me on the phone back in the early summer, the spring, and tried to tell me a little bit about this conference or this event that Belmont Abbey was working on, the way he presented it to me was, Andrew, we're looking for someone to just really mess things up. Get in there with your napalm and, cause some controversy. Oh, okay, well, I think you called the right guy, probably, and I think Alex knew that. And then a few weeks later, I asked for a Zoom meeting with Tom, our colleague, and Alex together, and Alex kind of reiterated that. And I said, well, Tom, what's the theme here? And he goes, well, it's really about friendship and being together. And I listened to him talk about that, and it was all lovely. And then I said, I'm confused. What is it that we want to do here? And the answer was, well, both. So I think my talk will reflect that. There's kind of a crazy side, and then there's a friendly side. So here we go. Let's see. And this talk does not have a title yet. But Dr. Boer, maybe you can name it after we're done. How about that? You have naming rights for whatever this ends up being. In the 1981 classic of contemporary moral philosophy, After Virtue, the late Alistair MacIntyre, who is my favorite Scottish ex-Marxist Aristotelian Catholic of all time. It's a very, very wide field. In the opening chapter, MacIntyre paints a vivid picture to illustrate the state of rational discourse about ethics in postmodernity. The chapter is called A Disquieting Suggestion. A disquieting suggestion. And it is as powerful a premise, I think, as has ever been imagined in any full-length science fiction dystopian novel that I have ever read. MacIntyre begins by asking us to imagine a world in which all of the natural sciences had been lost in some kind of cultural cataclysm. Some environmental catastrophes or nuclear disaster, he suggests, triggered a series of anti-science, know-nothing Luddite riots and an entire cultural movement. Laboratories are burned down. Technology is destroyed, smashed. Scientists are hunted down, driven underground, killed. The subject is banned from the schools forever. Books are burned by the millions. Museums are looted, left in ruins. The lights go out, literally and figuratively. After multiple generations of this scientific dark age, though, MacIntyre says, imagine that more enlightened elements of this new neo-Iron Age civilization attempt to reconstruct the natural sciences from such scraps and fragments of the old knowledge as they can dig up and scrounge together from the ruins. These reconstructors are enlightened, but ignorant, lacking all knowledge of what these sciences actually looked like in their wholeness. They are primitive builders and scroungers without a blueprint. I quote at some length from the book. I will not read it with a Scottish accent, as much as I'm very, very tempted to do so. MacIntyre writes, all that they possess are fragments, a knowledge of experiments detached from any knowledge of the theoretical context which gave them significance, parts of theories unrelated either to the other bits and pieces of theory which they possess or to experiment, instruments whose use has been completely forgotten, half chapters from books, single pages from articles, not always fully legible because torn and charred. Nonetheless, all these fragments are re-embodied in a set of practices which go under the revived names of physics, chemistry, and biology. Adults argue with each other about the relative merits of relativity theory, evolutionary theory, and phlogiston theory, although they possess only a very partial knowledge of each. Children learn by heart the surviving parts of the periodic table and recite as incantations some of the theorems of Euclid. Nobody, or almost nobody, realizes that what they are doing is not natural science in any proper sense at all. After Virtue, page 1. On the next page, MacIntyre says, This is the world of contemporary postmodern moral philosophy, moral discourse, in which dimly understood fragments of Aristotelianism, Christian, Nietzschean, utilitarian, and behavioralist philosophies are all crashing together like Homer's wandering rocks. These clashes occur not just between competing social groups and sects, but even inside the heads of incoherently thinking postmodern individuals who, on the one hand, espouse the ethic of the gospel, but erect it over a nihilistic, subjectivistic void. Or people who speak certain fragments of the language of classical virtue theory, but with a heavy accent of American pragmatism and an admixture of Deweyite vocabulary about democratic living and life adjustment. Disquieting, indeed. Now, it's interesting to me that in this opening chapter, MacIntyre does not cite the 1959 American sci-fi novel, A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter M. Miller, a veteran of the Second World War who personally participated in the aerial bombing and destruction of St. Benedict's Abbey at Monte Cassino. Talk about a life-altering experience. But that work of fiction, Leibowitz, develops a similar premise about the loss of science and technology after nuclear war and the attempts by Catholic monks living in the deserts of the Western US in the distant future to reconstruct it. I see a lot of people nodding. You know this book. If you have not read it, you should. It is a wonderful, wonderful read. Now, here's another disquieting picture, maybe a little comically disquieting. In his 1974 commencement address at Caltech, legendary teacher and Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard P. Feynman shreds the whole array of loopy, early 70s, flaky, hippie, California Taoist pseudoscience, from reflexology and ESP experiments and paraconsciousness to the study of extraterrestrials and the phenomenon of the allegedly telekinetic spoon bender Uri Geller, who was quite the minor celebrity back in the day. To my great delight, some of you who maybe follow my LinkedIn posts have read, Feynman includes educationism in his list of pseudosciences, noting that the same pedagogical experts, all with EDD degrees, and the same educationist industrial complex keep coming up with revolutionary new ways to teach math and reading every few years, while reading and math scores drop every year. And America continues to look to the same class of witch doctors to solve the problems which they have thus far failed to solve every time. Enough about that. To convey the essence of pseudoscience in all of its forms, Feynman conjures an image for his listeners, not from science fiction, but from recent anthropological observations of certain indigenous populations in South Pacific islands. Islands where, during the Great Pacific War of 1941 through 45, the US military had constructed air bases for bringing in food and other materiel for the troops. Air bases which were very busy in the day, but which were shut down and abandoned as soon as the war ended. What the anthropologists observed on these islands decades later, they called the cargo cults. On these islands, natives are remembering old days, or they've heard tales from their fathers or uncles about the times when the pale-faced men were there, summoning great roaring birds of the sky to fly down to them, bringing unimaginable material riches, socks, chewing gum, cigarettes, spam, canned peaches in heavy syrup. Oh, the delights. Most of these treasures, and many others beyond imagining, were kept by the pale-faced men for themselves, but sometimes they shared a few things with the natives. Then, one day, the pale-faced men all left. No more great birds came with riches. The practitioners of the cargo cults are religiously devoted to trying to bring the great birds back. They long for lucky strikes and canned fruit. They light fires alongside the abandoned runways, simulating the electric lights that no longer have generators to power them. They stand on the abandoned, cracked, overgrown tarmac with signal flags made of tree branches, waiting to communicate with the airplanes that never arrive. A shaman of special rank and holiness sits up high in the derelict control tower with split coconuts strapped around his ears to simulate a radio headset, chanting unknown verbal formulas into a microphone made of sticks and rocks. And the planes don't come. I cite these two images from McIntyre and Feynman, attempting to reconstruct science after a cataclysm, trying to summon cargo planes with coconuts, because I think these two images shine some rays of truth upon what we, as classical educators, are trying to do, with varying degrees of success and a lot of frustration and failure all the time. We are trying to reassemble a lost culture of learning and teaching that most of ourselves never participated in on the basis of scraps and charred fragments of old, half-understood wisdom. We are trying to summon the mythical beasts of virtue and wisdom from the sky, using as tools the tree branches, campfires, and coconuts with which our own indigenous, Native American postmodernism has equipped us. All of us here, we are those post-cataclysmic enlightened ones doing our darndest to try to reconstruct lost and unknown sciences. This entire Sharing Salt weekend is kind of a liturgical celebration of the classical ed cargo cult, hoping to summon the cigarettes and syrup from the skies to give them to the children of America, or something like that. You know what I mean? No more out of you. We heard plenty of you last night. Being, to greater and lesser extent, all damaged ourselves in our experience of culture and formation, we are not always successful in repairing the damage wrought by this cultural cataclysm. Consider some examples of us natives trying our best, doing what we can. Example number one, a classical elementary school commissions its art teacher to paint a massive mural replica of what painting is it probably going to be? School of Athens, exactly, on a wall in the main entryway of the elementary school. Now, we all know the painting well. At the center of it, Plato and Aristotle gesturing up and out, respectively. In a less well-known detail, they're grasping with their other hands what? Okay, two books. Clearly labeled, their titles are clearly labeled with their Italian equivalents on the spines. The practical and empirical Aristotle has a copy of his Nicomachean Ethics, which Raphael renders in Italian as Etica, E-T-I-C-A. Plato carries a copy of the Timaeus, a speculative work about astronomy, metaphysics, and the world's soul. Timaeus is called in Italian Timeo, T-I-M-E-O. The grade school artist, unfamiliar with the Platonic corpus, let alone with the Italian titles of the Platonic works, misreads the lettering in Raphael's painting when making her replica, with the result being, on the wall of this school for 15 years now, Plato is carrying a book called the Timbo, which sounds like a classic Disney animated character of some sorts, perhaps a flying hippo with a helicopter rotor tail. Don't ever YouTube and see what hippos do with their very fast-moving tails. It's truly appalling, truly disgusting. Don't ever look it up. The Timbo. All right, number two. While doing their units on classical Greek art, it always starts with a unit. A unit. Cringy word. A class is assigned to make representations of amphorae and drinking craters. Sounds good so far, by using black and orange construction paper. Oh, sounds pretty authentic. The teacher tells them depictions of the mythical gods and heroes are okay. They're preferred. You can do that if you want, but you can also make your own designs. The results are inevitable. While we have some vases with Achilles and Ajax playing dice, or Odysseus resisting the sirens, we also get Greek vases with Minecraft images, skateboards and guitars, right, we can handle that. But scenes from various anime, legends, and of course, an attempt to portray Aphrodite on a screen as some kind of TikTok influencer. Whenever we hear the phrase, make your own, ... we should rend our garments in anguish and offer reparation for our pedagogical sins. Make your own. No. I once saw an entire first grade at a classical school complete its astronomy unit with a make your own planet project. We had cube-shaped worlds, physically impossible ring systems. Everyone knows rings only orbit in the same direction around the equator of rotation. Duh. And even a gigantic space cheeseburger. I'm sorry, first graders cannot make their own planets. Only gods can do such things as make their own planets. Speaking of which, in this same classical school, down another hallway, a different group of children was once instructed to, anyone want to start with me? Make your own Greek god. Which, coming from the sweet, innocent, good faith Christian young lady with the education degree from the nearby state university, it was actually kind of Nietzschean. Create your own gods. Smash the old ones. Live dangerously. Mit einem Hammer philosophieren, hammer philosophizing. Very exciting for the third graders. Number 3, the top leadership of a classical charter school network gathers in a room for a meeting of the utmost importance. The mission? The boss speaks up. All right, we're going to whiteboard some virtues. We're going to have a list. We're going to get some posters. We're going to put them all up around the school. So which one should we pick? What's a good number? Someone says, well, I think at least 5. Someone else says, well, less than 10. That'd be too many. Let's brainstorm. Okay, courage. Yeah, sounds good. Wisdom. Prudence. Wait, are wisdom and prudence the same? I don't know. Kindness. Is that a virtue? What about friendship? Well, sort of a virtue, Aristotle says, or it's accompanied with virtue. Nah, throw it out. Can we say temperance, or will people think we're talking about booze? Can't be too brainy here because we want the kids and the parents to understand. Can we talk about chastity? Hornet's nest. How about authenticity? What, are we Heidegger here? No. Okay, ready? Let's vote on our virtues. In the end, a canon is democratically elected. Like Bismarck said, there are things that civilized and decent people should never, ever allow themselves to watch being made. One is sausage, and the other is legislation. We can add to that the third thing, lists of virtues for classical schools. So a canon is established and posters are printed and distributed. Invariably, within weeks, certain teachers are fudging a little bit, customizing the official virtues, tampering with them, making slightly different canons, unique to their own class, or maybe they're inventing their own virtues. In one class, tolerance has slipped in. In another, a very prickly type of teacher who suffers no fools. I love these guys. They're wonderful teachers. They're a pain in the ass when they work for you. Refuses to put up the posters saying, I will not propagandize virtue to children. In another room, a different teacher quietly puts up placards of the 4 cardinal virtues only and begins amiably trying to persuade her colleagues that we don't need some special list of our virtues because the tradition with a capital T has already given us one, to no avail. 1,000 miles away, the leadership of a totally different classical school in a different state gets together to come up with their virtues. They produce an entirely different list, a little bit of overlap, but now they got their own virtues. They put these on t-shirts, coffee mugs, a school song. They start holding pep rallies based upon their own virtues. Something's off about that. Number 4, a classical school organizes an intergrade day of athletic competition on the theme of the Greek Olympics. Sounds good. What could go wrong? Well, no javelin throwing, weighted discus, or oiled up wrestling can take place. Unfortunately, not very authentic, but okay. Setting that aside, the classrooms are assigned the identity of historical Greek city-states. You know, there's a Thebes, there's an Argos, there's an Athens, and so on. In the preparations for the games, the teachers are instructed to get creative Well, that word creative, ooh, you know what that leads to. And come up with signs, posters, official colors, war chants, etc., to animate polis spirit amongst the children. Some classrooms, classical iconography is chosen. The Athenian owl is put at the center of a cardboard shield and the kids walk around with it. In another classroom, the teacher, a former public school varsity cheerleading captain, dips into her deep cultural background and trains her students in various hip-shaking, clapping, and stomping dance routines and classical war chants such as, "Wish you were a Spartan, ooh, ah. Wish you were a Spartan, ooh, ah." Now, you say what you want about the Spartans, but they've got spirit. Yes, they do. They've got spirit. How about you, Darius, great king, king of kings? Number 5, a middle school English teacher in a classical school, 10 years of non-classical school training and experience under her belt. After 2 weeks on Beowulf, begins the last class with a special treat. "We are going to have a Socratic seminar," she tells her 8th graders. Our discussion question is this: Beowulf is a hero. What does heroism mean to you? What followed, of course, was a useless teen gabfest, replete with references to vaguely understood historical figures, Martin Luther King, my grandpa, Spider-Man, no Beowulf whatsoever, all excitedly and formlessly delivered in the spontaneous, natural, chattering, chirping dialect of teen English, constructed around the expression, "like it's like, I feel like it's like." That's a Socratic discussion about heroism. All right. Now, maybe you don't find all of these examples equally worrisome. Hopefully you're feeling something is off about each one of them. However, I will say, if you find all of these to be very much in order, what's the big deal? Sounds pretty classical to me. Then permit me to suggest we need to share salt a lot longer. We may have to do so for 18 months straight. Your families will be contacted to inform them of your delayed return. Do not try to reach them. I don't think that's necessary here. Okay, the kind of classroom scenes that I've just described are what invariably happens when we try to reconstitute a different world in an existing one that is not aligned to it. The world of classical liberal education, it was just shaped very differently from the world that has formed all of us. When you try to cram a hat into a shoebox and take it on a plane, deformation, warping will occur. As contemporary classical educators, we have a wineskin problem. It's often as if we're trying to reconstruct the music of Bach, but never having heard any performance of Baroque music before, and playing it not on harpsichord, organ, lute, viola da gamba, but upon the combination of whatever's at hand: a cheap plastic ukulele, harmonica, an F, an African thumb piano that only plays 5 notes, a Fisher-Price glockenspiel in C major, and a thunderously loud 800-watt electric bass guitar rig with onboard digital effects processing. On top of that, we're trying to sing the Ode to Joy, which is Beethoven, not Bach. And not one of us has any idea how to pronounce German, so we're guessing based upon the English phonics conventions we are familiar with. Früdi, Schoni, Gutterfunken. That's funny to some of you. I heard one little chuckle. I did not hear Agagi Margos from you, so that's okay. Now, maybe I'm letting my extended Baroque orchestra metaphor carry me away here. That's the fun thing about metaphors. They carry you away from one side of things to the undiscovered country on the other side. It's a ferry boat into the unknown. We, classical and liberal educators of all stripes and sects and experiences, we are this motley crew, trying nothing less than the performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion, as if we had just discovered the only surviving manuscript of it 4 centuries in the future, when no one speaks German. Musical notation is an arcane subject known only to a few, and then only partially. And the available instruments are completely different from the ones in Bach's day. And most music older than 20 years has been completely lost and is no longer hearable. In circumstances like this, we have to cooperate by dividing. We divide and conquer. If we are to pick up this cultural thread, which as thin and scanty as it seems to be sometimes, has not been broken. Never has it been broken. It was not broken in the Middle Ages. It was just the flame was barely kept alive until it flared up again in the high Middle Ages. It's not broken yet. However thin and frayed this thread may be in some places, we've got to divide the labor. Work diligently on our own pieces of it. Stay informed of what the other work groups are doing. Reject all temptations to separatism, partisanship, denominationalism, the pronouncing of anathemas, and maintain a clear view of the whole. This movement must, if it is to succeed, be with a lowercase c, Catholic, katholon in the Greek. It must take a view of the whole from the most expansive sense. There must be no, I follow Apollos, I follow Paul, I follow Circe, I follow ICLE. That's no way to form an orchestra, let alone to heal a culture. In my Catholic, lowercase c, vision of classical liberal education, and I love the fact that here at Belmont Abbey, it's the master's program in classical liberal education. I've been doing this for so long. I remember when no one called it classical. We called it liberal education 30 years ago. And that was kind of wonky because sometimes you'd get leftists who would say, I'm just so glad that you're doing liberal education. We interviewed somebody once for a fundraising position almost 30 years ago, and she had a nose ring. Now, nowadays, nose rings are a dime a dozen, but 30 years ago, woo, it was way out there. And she, again, saw liberal education, so I'm really excited about working for progressive causes in the public schools. But I want us to get back to this idea of liberal education. And from now on, I'm only going to say classical liberal education. I really think that that's a piece, that's a wholeness that we need to reintegrate. And make sure that we are thinking liberally about the classical tradition. Because I think it's very possible to think illiberally about the classical tradition. And I believe that one of the things that unites our movement is its liberality. Get into that maybe a little bit later. In my Catholic, lowercase c, vision of classical liberal education, there's room in the orchestra for all traditions and ecclesiologies of Christians, for Jews, for pagans, both ancient and modern, for skeptics, agnostics, deists, and intellectually honest provisional atheists who remain open to the transcendent and find value in the honest study of expressions of it. Now, some dogmas and ways of thinking must be rejected. They cannot be allowed in the tent of classical liberal education. But I submit that Christians, Jews, atheists, any one of them could all potentially succumb to certain illiberal ways of thinking that might place us outside the tent, just as surely as the dogmatic, militant Marxist cuts himself off from the vine, so too, I submit, might a Christian of a certain illiberal dogmatic frame of mind separate himself from the classical liberal tradition in culture and education. The dividing line is not between us and them. Right? The dividing line is in our hearts, between our better angels and our worse angels, between a liberal, charitable spirit and an illiberal spirit. So what is it that I believe that we can all agree upon? Do we as classical educators have the equivalent of a Nicene Creed that can unite Catholic, Orthodox, and Reformation Christians? What is the Tao of our movement? I'm talking about the C.S. Lewis Tao here. What's the Feynman atomic principle upon which all of the science could perhaps be reconstructed? What is it we agree upon? Well, I'm going to propose things that I think can hold this Catholic lowercase c movement of classical liberal educators together. In doing so, I think it's helpful to consider these articles of faith as antitheses to certain tendencies in our postmodern American culture and the American mind. To wit, number one, the American mind is deeply emotivist and sentimental, inclined to view having right feelings as a substantial act by itself of moral virtue. This is what leads to virtue signaling. Inclined to view the rational tradition of ethical discourse and moral philosophy as something alien to, maybe even hostile to, being a good person. Classical liberal educators in the small c Catholic tradition, we can instead share a more expansive, broad, liberal view of the moral life that gives due place to both the heart and to the head, recognizing reason as the ruling element in the soul, while at the same time recognizing that reason stands powerless before the passions. In John Henry Newman's words, to try to shape the moral life with reason alone is to attempt to quarry granite with a razor blade, or to moor a great ship by a silken thread. As classical liberal educators, we must reanimate the tradition of rational discourse about ethics. There's no room for adherence to, be they conscious or unconscious, non-cognitive emotionalism in ethics. Number two, underlying that previous point, a problem with the American soul is that it is naturally anti-intellectual, viewing reason and the life of the mind as suspicious, incompatible with economic productivity, the real world, maybe incompatible with right feelings. Oftentimes in American Christianity, and I'm not pointing out one particular denomination or church or tradition, sometimes viewed as incompatible with religion and faith. We Americans have a unique disdain for fancy book learning. We have a skepticism or hostility towards pointy-headed intellectuals. Sometimes we're affected by the inability to distinguish between the genuine practice of philosophy and intellectual navel-gazing. American educationism, as a secular establishment, has been on a century-long crusade to devalue what it calls mere factual knowledge or rote memorization in the schools, with the result being general knowledge about history, geography, science, fable, mythology at an all-time low. I will add that the puritanical legacy of total depravity can be a problem when applied to the intellect. In this vision, the salvation of reason, if it can be called that, is for it to be devoted only to practical, technical tasks like farming, or business, or banking, maybe also some technical dogmatic theology. This puritanical view of intellect, which is residually present in much of our culture, this sounds familiar, only the instrumental, technical, utilitarian intellect is what matters, industriousness, right? This view, I think, is outside the pale of the spirit of classical liberal education. So too, I must say, and I'm a recovering Lutheran-style Protestant, still working to get over it, so too is Luther's typically broad and crude account of reason as des Teufels Dirne, the devil's whore. I'm not sure how you begin to educate if that's your view. What we classical liberal educators can instead agree upon, an alternative to anti-intellectualism in all of its forms, is that knowledge is a good, that truth is one, and that truth is a whole. There's that word again. That technical and scientific knowledge is valid, but it is different from moral, theological, and philosophical knowledge, which are just as real as science, authoritative in their own spheres. The classical liberal educators can agree that there is no essential, necessary, inherent opposition between fact knowledge and wisdom. They go together. It's on the basis of a lot of fact knowledge and experience that wisdom is attained. There is absolutely no essential tension between intellect and moral character. At the same time, classical liberal educators can all agree that the human intellect is deeply fallible, corruptible, error-prone. Some things it can see quite clearly, other things it sees through a glass darkly, sometimes through deeply tinted spectacles distorted by passion and ideology, very, very darkly. We can agree that man is a rational animal, made a little less than the angels, a piece of work. How noble in reason, how infinite in faculty. Number 3, the American mind is naturally fideistic in its religion, supposing that, I'm not talking about it as a theological position, I'm talking about it as a cultural orientation, supposing that right beliefs will magically make us and the works of our hands prosper. I think there's a practical heresy underlying this, the belief that grace obliterates all of nature, including our practical operative functions, when it enters into the soul. This idea that grace and nature are intrinsically opposed to each other. I think this manifests itself in, maybe I sound too harsh to your ears here, and I speak these words in love about brother and sister Christians. I think there's a misunderstanding that's very possible of the idea that Christ says, without me, you can do nothing. If I may be so bold, I don't think what Christ is saying is that without him, we cannot read, write, practice medicine, tie our shoes, make art and music. American Christian fideism, and I think any religious believer who dogmatically insists that outside of faith, all is darkness, error, evil, and futility without qualification, has placed himself outside of the classical liberal tradition. Such believers, whatever faith they espouse, in the shape of their thinking, they're not different at all from what is said about the Muslim Caliph Umar, who commanded the final destruction of the Library of Alexandria in the 13th century with the words, "If it contains works contrary to Quran, burn them, for they are false. If it contains works that agree with the Quran, burn them, for they are superfluous." Contrarily, the classical liberal educator takes an expansive view of religion and truth, holding that while the church teaches the truth about God and salvation, and that this is the highest and most important truth, there are other levels of truth, lower, but not absolutely unimportant, not invalid, that considered by themselves don't have anything to do with faith and the life of faith, and about which the faith cannot properly speak. Complementarily, talking about the whole, not just one side of things, the classical liberal educator sees no contradiction with that view of types of knowledge and distinctions between knowledge, and the view that all things point to God, and that all of reality is most fully understood in the light of faith, that all of nature is akin, as Socrates says in the Meno, and that through him all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. As a last antithesis and point of agreement to consider, I would note that the contemporary American mind is uniquely inattentive to, if not abusive of, language. The American soul is as copious and blabbering and chatty and imprecise in speech as it is shallow. The American soul is inclined towards a functionalist, utilitarian view of language as just a tool to get certain ideas across, naively believing oftentimes that basically the same ideas can be expressed in all kinds of different ways. Content's the same. Content can just be boiled off and abstracted from the words, and injected into any other number of words. Content is what matters. The American mind is demotic and vulgar in its implicit philosophy of language, with a fetish for what is common, natural, unpolished, untutored, sloppy, blunt. The American mind recoils naturally at the suggestion that speech and grammar should be corrected and shaped and directed in young people, viewing higher registers of language and syntactical complexity as inauthentic, artificial, snooty, or highfalutin. The American mind is also naturally inclined towards the cynical, manipulative tendencies of sloganeering, politicking, and advertising, and on the flip side, towards the naive preachiness of feel-good exhortations, motivational speakers and posters, facile moralizing pep rallies. The American mind has no idea how language works, has no idea how different languages work, and sees no value in learning foreign tongues. True story, the CEO of a major classical charter network is on record as having said to multiple people, "I've never learned any foreign language in my life, and there's absolutely nothing missing from my own education." Quod erat demonstrandum? As a counterforce, classical liberal educators can all agree that language is more than just a tool. It is central to what it means to be human. It is an instrument not just that we use and manipulate, but that can shape and mold us and our thoughts. That clear and good and precise language enables us to have clear, good, precise thoughts. Sloppy and slovenly language makes us have sloppy, slovenly thoughts. The classical educator thinks, whether literally or metaphorically, it can be both. Even if we believe that one perspective is more complete than the other, we can agree that language is a gift from God. It is divine. The universe was summoned into being through speech. All things were made through logos, through the word. As a result of this view of language, the classical liberal educator cares for language in education in a special way. We are devoted to the cultivation of the arts of language, grammar and rhetoric in their fullest senses, as the intellectual virtues of reading, interpreting, listening, speaking, and writing. We classical liberal educators do not detach or sever the liberal art of logic from the rest of the trivium, drying it out, desiccating it. We teach it along with grammar and rhetoric, all things together, all of the time. We classical liberal educators can all agree not just upon the value of studying foreign language in general, but upon the essential importance of the classical tongues, Latin first and thoroughly for all, never to the total neglect of Greek. Classical liberal educators, because of our care for language, we can be devoted to the lost arts of deep, close reading, rigorous reading and interpretation of texts, not the American way of speed reading, reading to extract or summarize basic ideas, functional literacy, or of what often passes for interpretation, both in lower schools and even in the halls of academia, along the lines of, well, this one phrase or word here reminds me of some things that have nothing to do with the text. So let me tell you all about them. Not that. The classical liberal educator recognizes words and texts cannot just be made to mean any old thing, and that their meaning is not to be found in whatever our personal responses are. The classical liberal educator alone in this culture, in this day, is in the position to rightly understand and correctly teach poetry, drama, fiction, literary art. We should all be able to agree that there is truth in literature, but such truth cannot be boiled off and stated abstractly. Truth in literature is not propositional. It is not dogmatic. I hope we can agree that great literature cannot be reduced without doing great violence to it, without warping and cramping the minds of students, to mere lessons about moral virtue. Classical liberal educators can agree upon the centrality of reading and the unity of reading, that the reading of literature, expository works, and Holy Scripture itself are not three completely different and separate kinds of reading, akin only in as much as they are alphabetically denoted. I think we can all agree that the liberal arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric are indispensably necessary for all forms of reading, profane and sacred alike. One last point about language. I think we classical liberal educators have great potential to agree upon the importance of what could be called alternately the dialectic method of education, or as is popularly known sometimes, the Socratic method. The question, response, criticism of the Platonic dialogues, the disputatio in the Western medieval tradition, the debate and argumentative tradition of the Jesuit ratio studiorum, the perpetually self-correctable movement of natural science when it is honest, the oral examination of doctoral candidates, the neo-Socratic method of the 20th century Adler, Paideia, great books tradition. I think we classical liberal educators, however much we might disagree about what Socratic instruction ought to look like and where it should be done, we can agree proper dialectic Socratic method in education has an impact which dogmatic instruction, didactic instruction can never achieve. We can also recognize the limits of the dialectic and Socratic method, its greater and lesser suitability for certain subjects, groups, or age levels of students. I believe there is potential for us as classical liberal educators to come to agreement about distortions of the dialectic Socratic method. We can recognize equally to be avoided are, on the one hand, formless, anything goes, going nowhere is the point, the journey is everything. On the other hand, we also can agree, I hope, that a dried, desiccated, arid parody of Socratic discussion in which the teacher asks pretend questions that are merely a springboard for him to give his own answers, or in which every student answer must be immediately corrected and clarified by the teacher. I think we can save the Socratic method from its own worst enemies, who are often its most enthusiastic, self-styled practitioners. So to summarize, the basic principles I propose we can all agree upon. Number one, the power and limitations of rational ethics and moral philosophy. Number two, the essential goodness of intellect and knowledge and the mind's limitations and fallibility. Number three, the right relationship between faith and reason, the powers and limitations of each. Number four, the primacy of language, grammar, logic, rhetoric, the centrality of reading, the truth of poetry and fiction, and the indispensability of the classical tongues. So what curricular choices should be made in light of these principles? What should be taught and when? How should different things be taught? How should different age groups be taught? We will never stop working out the answers to these practical questions. They aren't obvious. They're hard. The more liberal, charitable, and gracious spirit in which we work together in different places, the more fruits can our branches bring forth. Let me close with two theses attributed to two great canonical thinkers. I'm pretty sure we can all agree upon their importance. One is from Aristotle, from the Metaphysics. Discovering the truth is in one way easy and another way hard. It is easy because each person can find a piece of it. It's hard because no one person can discover all of it by himself. Finally, not Augustine. I mention Augustine because he's a canonical thinker we can all agree upon. There's a sentence ascribed to him, which is not actually his. It's still beautiful. Augustine didn't say it, but I'm invoking his authority to baptize and bless it. It's actually found in the works of a 17th century German Lutheran pastor who wrote under a pseudonym as Rupertus Meldenius. And because of the centrality of Latin, I shall give it to you in the original before offering a translation. Si nos servaremus in necessariis unitatem, in non necessariis libertatem, in utrisque caritatem, optimo certe loco essent res nostrae. If in necessary things we preserve unity, in unnecessary things, liberty, and in all the other things, charity, then our affairs will most certainly be in the best place. Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit. Heavenly God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we ask that you will bless our work to educate, to shape souls of young people, to prepare them to receive the measure of truth that they are ready to receive at whatever point they are in their lives. We know that all things point to you. Make us in faith and charity one. Make us to be one. As our Lord said, ut unum sint, that they all may be one. Bless our work. Please smile upon our friendships and be with us always. Amen. Father, Son, Holy Ghost.